Interrogative pronouns and relative pronouns are family of each other. They are because basically the words are the same. You will see they all start with a W, and the interrogative pronouns are words like who, whose, to whom, what, which. Relative pronouns are the same words, who, whose, whom, what, and which. There's a slight difference between the two, however. Let's look at interrogative pronouns. Interrogate, just like the word says, means to ask questions. Therefore, we know that all these W words should ask a question. Take note that there's one word that's not a W word, and it's the word how. So the words that make interrogative pronouns are the who, whose, to whom, what, which. You'll note that they all start with W. And there's one exception, how. And because it is an interrogative pronoun, it must ask a question. Now have a look at the relative pronouns. The relative pronouns all start with a W, but it has one exception too. The exception is the word that. So all the relative pronouns start with a W, like who, whose, whom, what, and which. But there is an exception, and it is the word that. Please make sure that the word that does not point to something. A word that points to something is actually called a demonstrative pronoun, and we will speak about those later. So remember, for now, that the relative pronouns are the words that start with a W, like who, whose, whom, what, which, and the exception is that. That does not point to something. Right, let's have a look at some examples. I'm going to give you some sentences, and you will decide if the words that start with a W are interrogative pronouns or relative pronouns. Let's look at the first sentence. Who is that boy? Do you notice that there's a W word and there's a that? Now we have to see if it complies to the rules of an interrogative pronoun and a relative pronoun. So let's look at the word who. We have to ask ourselves, does it start with a W? Yes, it does. And does it ask a question? Yes, it does. A word that asks a question and starts with a W is called an interrogative pronoun. Now let's have a look at the word that. If you can recall, we said here that a relative pronoun starts with who, whose, whom, which, what, and that. But I told you as well, that cannot point to something. So let's see if that points to something. Who is that boy? If I drew a picture, I would have drawn a person pointing to a specific boy. Who is that boy? This word points to the boy, and therefore it is not a relative pronoun. Have a look at the sentence. Which is the dog that barks so much? And we notice that there's a question mark at the end. So let's have a look at the first word, which. Do you notice something about it? It starts with a W. And we know that the W words that ask questions are called interrogative pronouns. Now let's have a look at the other word that catches our eye. It's the word that. We know the word that can be a relative pronoun, like we see here. Remember we said all the W words, who, whose, whom, what, which, they do not ask questions, and the word that, if it does not point to something, those are all relative pronouns. So let's look at the word that. So we have to determine something. Does it point to something? And let's see. Which is the dog that barks? The word that we can clearly see is not pointing to a specific dog. Nope, it does not. And therefore we know it explains the rest of the sentence. The dog that barks so much. The word that, in this case, is a relative pronoun. Here is another example. Where did that boy who doesn't brush his hair come from? And we can see it's a question. So let's look at the question word. Where did the boy come from? Question mark. The word where starts with a W and it asks a question. Therefore we know it is an interrogative pronoun. Well done. Now let's have a look at the word who. We need to determine if the word who asks a question. So let's have a look at the sentence. Where did that boy who doesn't brush his hair? Who doesn't brush his hair is clearly not a question. In fact, it is more like an explanation. So the word who is not interrogative. What would the word who be? The word who can only then be a relative pronoun. Remember that a relative pronoun, can you remember what it says? Starts with a W, like who, whose, whom, what, which, and also the word that. But they do not ask questions. This word clearly does not ask a question, so I know it's a relative pronoun. Now let's have a look at the word that. We know that could be a relative pronoun because it's one of the exceptions. We have said if a word starts with a W like who, whose, whom, what, which, and they do not ask questions. But also if the word that does not point to something, then we know it is a relative pronoun. So let's have a look at the word that. That boy. Where did that boy? And it points to something. We know it points directly to the boy. Now we know that can therefore not be a relative pronoun. A relative pronoun, its exception, the word that, can never point to something. It is usually used as an explanation. Let's look at these two sentences. How is Peter doing? First thing we notice, it's a question sentence. So let's have a look at the first word, how. Could how be one of the interrogative pronouns? Now we know interrogative pronouns start with a W and they ask a question. But there is one exception, and this is the exception, how. So how, that is asking a question, is therefore an interrogative pronoun. Now have a look at the sentence just below it. I don't know how he is. Here I see the word how again. And now here I have determined that if it is an interrogative pronoun, it could start with a W, who, whose, to whom, which, what, but also the word how. But the key is it has to ask a question. So here I find the word how, and it is not asking a question. So I know the word how cannot be an interrogative pronoun. Let's look at this sentence. I know that I am wrong. Do you see the word that? Now we know sometimes a relative pronoun can have an exception, which is the word that, as you can see here. But what can you remember about that? It can never point to something. It's more like an explanation. So let's see if this is an explanation or if it points to something. I know that I am wrong. Clearly this one is an explanation. And if it is an explanation, it's not pointing to something, then I know it is also a relative pronoun. Have a look at the next one. The next one says, that girl, that one, that girl knows that she is wrong. So let's underline the word that and the other one that. And let's have a look at the first word, that. Now we need to determine if it points to something. Let's see. That girl. It points to that girl. Therefore we know that this is not a relative pronoun because it points to something. Remember what I said? A relative pronoun has all the W words, but it can also have that. But please remember that cannot point to something. It's more like an explanation. Therefore, this one is incorrect because it says that girl. It points to something. It's not an explanation. But let's have a look at this one. That girl knows that she is wrong. Here we go with an explanation. That she is wrong is an explanation. And therefore I know it is a relative pronoun. Right, let's recap. An interrogative pronoun asks a question. And it usually starts with a W. Asks a question. A relative pronoun starts with a W, but it does not ask a question. Let's make a cross over it so that you can remember. An interrogative pronoun starts with a W, but it asks a question, and we know that there's an exception, and the exception is how, provided how asks a question. A relative pronoun, like we said, right, they all start with a W. They do not ask questions, and there is an exception. The exception is that. But that must not point to something. It is an explanation. Now, if you remember these things, it should be quite easy to find the wobblies.